our next guest, and our next guest is Vince Polito, Dr. Vince Polito, Senior Lecturer from the School of Psychological Science at Macquarie University. Vince has a keen interest in understanding how altered states of consciousness can impact on cognition and mental health, and he and his students have studied hypnosis, states of flow, meditation, yoga, chanting, virtual reality, religious rituals, and psychosis. And Vince was also one of the first events that I saw out of lockdown here in Melbourne with his travelling show of oddities. So I will welcome Vince now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Vince Polito. I work at Macquarie University in the School of Psychological Sciences there. And I wasn't really sure what I should talk about for this webinar tonight, so I decided that I would just give a little bit of an overview of some of the work that I've been doing in my lab at Macquarie, and really try and tell a little bit of a story of how we've got to where we are doing psilocybin research. It's been a bit of a journey. I've been looking at altered states of consciousness for most of my academic career, but I've only really been focusing on psychedelics for about the last 6 or 7 years. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how that program of research has developed, and hopefully that'll be interesting and curious to some of you. So to begin with, I just wanted to kind of take a really broad scope of psychedelic research and think about this question of what is it really that psychedelic research is aiming to discover. And the main thing that we see in the news and that we read about and that most research focuses on in psychedelics currently is on the clinical applications. And so there's applications around mental health and physical health. And largely psychedelics so far have been studied with mental health applications in mind. You're going to hear from some of the other speakers later about some of the many trials that are now happening within Australia, but the sorts of mental health issues that psychedelics have been investigated for are things like depression, PTSD, anxiety, different forms of addiction, body image disorders, those kinds of things. And it's great. I mean, it's wonderful, important research. And the fact that psychedelics are showing signs of efficacy across many of these different conditions is part of the reason that there is this huge interest in the topic at the moment. But there are some other really interesting aspects to psychedelic research that don't get quite as much attention. So another type of research that that I think is quite important for psychedelic research is mechanistic research. And so the topics that I put on this slide are by no means exhaustive, but just some examples of some of the sorts of questions and topics that I think fit in these different categories. And so mechanistic research might look at things like, what is the role of the altered state that occurs when someone takes a psychedelic, and what impact does that have? Or what are the predictors of the different types of outcomes that people have following psychedelic experiences? Another topic of research that we could look at would be cognitive enhancement. This is sometimes being referred to as the betterment of well people. So rather than just thinking about psychedelics as something that has clinical applications or could treat illness, it also seems like there's many, many clues that psychedelics can be used for potentially increasing creativity, changing attentional capacities, or learning. These are less investigated topics that I think are quite important. We might also use psychedelics as a way of doing intrinsic consciousness research. And that sounds like a mouthful perhaps, but what I mean by that is just using psychedelics as a way of trying to learn more about how consciousness works itself. So more pure kind of research. So really characterizing the altered states that occurs, and also looking at the neuroscience of these conscious states. What is psychedelics doing to different brain regions and brain interconnectivity? And then the final category I've put here is social psychology of psychedelic use. I wasn't as sure what to call this one, but this is questions around the longer term impacts of using psychedelics or having psychedelic experiences. And so things like attitude changes, belief changes, interpersonal relationships. And I kind of feel that as you go from left to right across these different categories, there's less and less research. Certainly there are people looking at all of these things, but the vast majority of attention and funding and effort seems to go more towards the clinical applications and mechanistic research, which obviously are important, but I think these more green topics are also really fascinating. And these are things that I try and get into exploring in some of the research that I do. So to tell you a little bit more about my research journey into psychedelics, I first started looking at the topic of microdosing around 2016 or 2017. And this was a fascinating topic to me because when microdosing first became popular, there was this sudden explosion of media stories and internet interest, but there was no science. The sort of wild, the practice of microdosing in the wild, people experimenting, trying these things, was way ahead of any sort of empirical evidence. And so I was really curious just to figure out what is going on here. Is there really some kind of pharmacological effect, or is this all just placebo and expectation? And so the first sort of stage of my microdosing research was a longitudinal study, and it was an observational study. We weren't providing substances. We weren't even getting people to come into the lab. It was all just questionnaires set up in an anonymous system online. We found people who were already microdosing, and we got them to do a battery of measures at the start of the study and at the end, and also send in some simple ratings each day of the study. And what we were really trying to work out here was, does microdosing impact people's immediate mood? And was there any evidence of long-term cognitive functioning? And we had a really strong interest in this study. We had about 100 people sign up and complete all of these measures, which was quite a lot considering that they are having to do something every day for about 6 weeks to just kind of graph out the sort of diagram of the study design there. Like I said, this big battery of measures at the start and at the end, and then simple daily ratings of whether they'd taken a dose each day and how they felt on a number of different sort of mood ratings. And I won't go into the results in too much detail, but just a couple of highlight results. This is the sorts of things that we found in those daily ratings. It looks like a kind of complicated graph, but basically what it's showing here is that first data point on each graph is like the baseline rating. So the first chart there is happiness. You can see a baseline rating of about 3.25. When on the days when people took a microdose, that jumped up to about 3.8. But then the following days, 1 day after microdose, 2 days after microdose, it pretty much dropped back down to baseline. And so we had, I've just got these 3 examples here, but we had a range of these ratings, all sort of showing that same pattern of this immediate boost on dosing days, not much evidence of sustained effects afterwards for those mood states. And then the other part of the study was looking at the more rigorous cognitive behavioral measures at the beginning and at the end of the study. We had some pretty interesting findings here. We found that people depression scores and stress scores significantly dropped from baseline to the end of that 6-week period. We also found some drops in mind wandering and increases in absorption, which is just a type of attentional capacity. And so certainly some evidence that something was going on there in that study. And that was definitely enough to kind of spark my interest and get me more interested in this question of microdosing and try and do a bit more investigation into what's going on. And that study was quite well received. I got a good reaction from my colleagues, even though I wasn't sure what people were going to think of starting to do psychedelic research. And so I was really encouraged to continue on. And the next sort of stage of the microdosing research that we moved into was to try and do some neuroimaging of microdoses. And so this was a really an unusual design for a study in many ways, because we were still targeting existing microdoses, and we were not providing the substance to them. We were getting people who were already microdosing to come into our day when they'd taken a microdose. And so it was kind of a hybrid between an observational study and a lab-based study. And in this study, we were really looking for markers of the acute effects of microdosing. That is, could we find some sort of objective indicators that something might be going on the days when people microdose? And so we were using this magnetoencephalography brain scanner, which is this big fancy brain imaging device. We also took blood samples to see if there were any indications of microdosing effects. And the other thing that was interesting about this study is we adopted a design that was developed by a group at Imperial College in London called a self-blinding design, where we got participants to create a capsule with a microdose in it and a capsule with placebo, so just non-psychedelic mushrooms or some other similar material. We provided them with labeled envelopes, and they would put those capsules in the envelopes, mix them up, and then take off the labels, so they end up with just 2 black envelopes. And they'd come into the lab on 2 occasions, one time when they taking one of the capsules each time, And so they didn't know what they'd taken. We didn't know what they'd taken. And so it was a very effective way of having a placebo control without the expense or admin overhead of doing a proper clinical trial. So yeah, it was kind of, this study is a real mix of like really rigorous methods and analysis, but still uncontrolled dosing. And we're just about to finish this study now, actually. Recruitment is almost complete. We've got about 5 or 6 more sessions to test, and we'll have the results of this later this year. So that's been quite an exciting step. But I guess even more excitingly for me, this has now led to the opportunity to actually conduct a real clinical trial. And so this is sort of the next stage of microdosing research that we're getting into. And so we're going to do a proper placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial. This will be targeting people with moderate depression. We will be providing psilocybin in the study. And so we'll have people coming in for a 6-week intervention. They'll be taking a microdose 2 times a week. And we've got a whole battery of clinical, cognitive, neural, physiological, and social measures. The main sort of research question here is, is low-dose psilocybin an effective treatment for depression? And it's going to run for a few years. It's quite a big trial. It's a very collaborative trial. I've got some wonderful collaborators from across many institutions that are working in psychedelics that have helped sort of come up with this design and plan. We're starting probably June. It looks like we'll have our first participant in. So everything is just about ready to go. The sort of study design is going to look like this. I won't go through all of the details, but just to give a kind of overview, we've got a number of screening steps to make sure that participants really meet our eligibility criteria. People will then come in dosing twice a week, and we've got similar to before, a big battery of measures at the beginning and end, and then some acute measures on those different dosing days. We're going to do things like put people in a driving simulator on some of the days to see if there's evidence of impairment from these kinds of low doses. We've got some other impairment measures and some of the other cognitive and social measures as well. Okay, so that's really been the trajectory of the psilocybin research program. But to finish off, I did want to just say a little bit about some of the other things that we're doing in this lab. And some of this research isn't specifically on psilocybin or even psychedelics, but something that I've been really interested in is exploring the general effects of altered states. And there's been this huge focus on understanding psychedelics in the last few years, but I think many of the interesting phenomena that occur related to psychedelics also apply to some of these other altered states. And so a big focus of our research is looking at some other situations where consciousness is altered, which is interesting in itself, but it also has this practical value, which is that as we develop these methods and measures and approaches, these can also then be translated into psychedelic research. It's kind of, things are definitely changing, but it is still kind of hard to do psychedelic research to get the funding and the access to the substances and the approvals and those kinds of things. But it's much easier to do research on some of these other altered states. And so we use that as kind of like a sandbox or a lab of developing these methods that we then can filter into some of the more psychedelic-oriented research. So I'll just go through quickly some of the things that some of my students are working on at the moment. Abigail Peterson is got a really interesting project looking at nature relatedness and do intense altered state experiences change people's level of relatedness, and then does that actually translate into changes in pro-environmental behaviors? The next 2 students, Spencer and Julia, are looking at hypnosis. Spencer has created a really novel online intervention that seems to deliver hypnosis quite effectively through a web browser, which is pretty new and exciting. And so he's doing a lot of work on just comparing that to traditional forms of hypnosis. And then Julia is looking at some of these online hypnosis interventions to see if we can use those to improve cognitive performance and executive functioning and these kinds of things. James Thurbon has got a very cool project where he's looking at rapid flicker light and audio stimulation. So this is a phenomenon where if a bright light is shone extremely fast, people tend to have some aspects of alteration in consciousness, particularly around visual sensory effects. So people tend to experience all sorts of complex visual experiences, patterns, feel like they see different scenes moving and things like that. And so he's also going to be doing an MEG study looking at brain activity change in response to some of this visual and auditory overstimulation. Amber Bunting has got a really ambitious project where she's looking at all these different theories of self-consciousness and trying to map some of the commonalities and differences across these theories to see if we can come up with maybe a more unified framework, or if we can use these theoretical approaches to really design some experiments that are more clearly going to test different aspects of self-consciousness. And then finally, a couple of honours students this year, Sage Zimmern and Charles McKinley, have started what I think is going to be a really intriguing project where we're looking to see how people's motivations, beliefs, and the context in which they take a psychedelic impacts their immediate and lasting experiences afterwards. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. That's what's happening in our lab at the moment. I will finish, it's the very last thing, with two quick plugs. The first one is just to say that if anyone is interested in these kinds of topics, we do have a really nice program at Macquarie that gets into a lot of the fundamental skills that allow this kind of research. So the Bachelor of Cognitive and Brain Sciences might be something that you'd want to check out. And then the final thing is that project that I mentioned, looking at the way that beliefs and attitudes impact psychedelics, is looking for participants. So if you are someone that is likely to be taking a psychedelic in the next 6 months, we'd love to have you as a participant in this study. You can follow this link here, just bit.ly.mq psychedelic survey, or this QR code. We're really trying to get a large cohort for this. And something that I think is going to be quite unique and interesting about this project is we're really going to try and map out what the sort of different effects that people might have when taking a psychedelic in a festival setting compared to in underground therapy, compared to in a clinical trial, compared to maybe in a ritualistic setting. So we're really trying to get people planning to use psychedelics in all of those different types of environments and compare people's experiences. So it'd be great to have some input there. And I'm going to finish up there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vince. And I feel like it's the right time at the moment to be studying altered states. It sometimes feels like I'm the only one who's not in an altered state. And I have all sorts of questions around that kind of stuff. I find it a very intriguing area, and I'm so glad to hear that you are exploring those other altered states that sometimes get pushed to the side in favor of chemicals and plants.